Key concept 1.4 focuses on the age of European exploration and discovery. Europeans explored and settled overseas territories, encountering and interacting with indigenous populations. Most notably, the Europeans explored and settled in a part of the world they didn't know existed, the Americas. The first part of this key concept focuses on the fact that European nations were driven by commercial and religious motives to explore overseas territories and to establish colonies. The quest for material profit was by far the most important, and the commercial motives gave Europeans access to gold, spices, and luxury goods. It all began when the Ottoman Empire conquered Constantinople and cut off many of the trade routes that went into the East. These eastern trade routes brought back many spices and luxury goods that the Europeans had grown accustomed to. As a result of that, and even prior to that, Portuguese explorers began sailing down the coast of Africa, trying to find an all-water route to India. By 1497, they rounded the Cape of Good Hope and crossed the Indian Ocean, thus establishing their own routes in order to get the spices and luxury goods so needed by the Europeans. The Spaniards, with their explorer Christopher Columbus, decided to search for a western route to India. And in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean's blue, and when he landed in the Americas, he believed he was in the eastern parts of Asia. However, instead, even though he died not knowing he had founded a new continent that the Europeans didn't know existed, this new area made the Spanish particularly wealthy, gave them access to gold as well as silver mines throughout. In addition to the commercial motives for the states and that, there was enhanced personal wealth. The conquistadors and the pirates gained quite a bit from it. The conquistadors went for the glory of their mission and often came back handsomely rewarded with personal wealth. The most famous conquistadors are Hernando Cortez, who conquered the Aztec Empire, and Francisco Pizarro, who conquered Peru and the Incan Empire and claimed these lands for the Spaniards. In addition to conquistadors, pirates often acquired great wealth. The most famous of the pirates is Sir Francis Drake, and while the Spanish considered him a pirate, the English considered him a hero, and he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I. In addition to this, state power during this time period depended upon the economic theory of mercantilism. The idea of mercantilism was that a state's wealth determined its power and status, and that wealth would be measured in bullion, or gold and silver. In addition, mercantilism gave the state a new role in promoting commercial development, and part of this new role included the acquisition of colonies, as well as the establishment of protective tariffs. The new monarchs often competed with each other during this time for state power, and this mercantilistic competition encouraged the competition for overseas territories. In the 1400s and 1500s, the two major competitors were the Spanish and the Portuguese. And as stated earlier, the Portuguese gained access to the eastern routes and the Spanish to the western routes. But by the end of the 1500s, the English, and into the 1600s, the French also entered the picture. This competition continued out and through to the 1700s, where it peaked with the wars between the British and the French over North America, a concept that we'll discuss later on. In middle school, you probably learned about the three G's, God, Gold, and Glory, and we've essentially discussed the gold and the glory. But let's not forget about God. One of the most important motives, especially for the Spanish and the Portuguese, was to spread the faith, or missionary activity. As stated earlier, the Spaniards were probably the most influential in coming to the New World in order to spread the faith. They spread Catholicism throughout much of the New World, and as this was done, it was done in a number of ways. One was through missionary activities. They established missions along the West Coast. Another way was through the encomienda system, which we'll discuss in just a minute. The French and the British were not as much of missionaries as the Spanish, although there were some missionaries, French missionaries, who converted some Indians to Catholicism, and some British Puritans who converted some of the Indians. For the most part, the French focused on their relationship with trade, and the British focused on their relationship with pushing the Indians further westward and taking their land and settling their land. Another reason for Christianity, the growth of Christianity and the motive of Christianity, was to counter Islam. Islam had been growing throughout Europe, and the spread of Christianity was meant to build up forces in order to be able to defeat some of the Muslims, particularly the Ottoman Turks, who have been expanding further and further into Europe. And finally, as I said earlier, the encomienda system was a perfect example of how the Spaniards used Christianity to justify the physical and cultural subjugation of the Native Americans in the New World. The encomienda system is a pretty fancy word for a slave system, and the Indians were required to work on either the plantations or in the mines, and in turn this was justified because the Spaniards had to convert them to Christianity, thus the justification for this. While most Spaniards agreed with this, there were a few who spoke out against this practice, namely Bartholomew de la Casa, who wrote several tracts about how morally wrong it was to do what was happening to the Indians. He also wrote about the glories of the Aztec Empire and the Incan empires, and although he was in the minority, his ideas continued on later on in history. Another important cause that is going to advance the cause of the age of exploration and discovery was that there were advances in navigation, cartography, and military technology that allowed the Europeans to establish these empires. Navigational technology included the compass, better sails, and the use of the astrolabe. And essentially, this navigational technology not only made it impossible for Christopher Columbus to cross the Atlantic in 1492, but for future explorers to circumnavigate the globe, namely Ferdinand Magellan. Military technology such as gunpowder and the use of horses enabled the Europeans to conquer the great Aztec and Incan empires. These two empires rivaled any empire that existed in Europe. However, they didn't have gunpowder. The use of gunpowder and better cannons enabled the Europeans to essentially dominate these empires, and led to the subjugation of both the Aztec and Incan empires. In addition to this, Europeans established overseas empires and trade networks through coercion and negotiation. And just to kind of give you an idea of these empires established, the Portuguese were able to negotiate several coasts along the East African coast, as well as East Asia. And they also wound up claiming Brazil. On the map that is shown, the line of demarcation was drawn in 1492 by the Pope, separating the eastern and western trade routes. At the time, at the end of the 15th century, the Europeans were still not aware of the existence of the Americas, although Columbus had traveled there. And a year later, they moved the line westward. By moving the line westward, the Portuguese gained claim to Brazil. That treaty was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. The Spanish gained territories in the Americas, where they settled with plantations and mining, using their encomienda system, the Caribbean, as well as the Pacific area. One of the most important Pacific colonies of the Spaniards will be the Philippines, named after King Philip II. The French entered the game a little bit later, namely in the 17th century, and they took vast areas in Canada and the Mississippi River Valley. However, these areas were not very populated by the French. The French did not focus as much on settling as it did trading, and North America was known for the fur trade. The French, more important to the French, were their colonies in the Caribbean. These colonies had the vast sugar plantations and helped to bring in much extra income for the owners of these areas that relied upon slave labor, a concept we'll also discuss later on. The English were also late entering the game, but by the 1600s they had established 13 colonies in North America, as well as areas in as well as areas in the Caribbean that further contributed to their prestige during this time period. Finally, the Dutch. The Dutch in North America established New Amsterdam in the early 1600s. However, it was quickly taken away from them by the English. The Dutch had better success in Asia, where they established colonies in Malaysia and Indonesia, but the Dutch really throughout the 1600s became known as a trading empire, and new business methods by the Dutch and the invention of the joint stock companies that both the Dutch and the English used enabled them to explore, colonize, and conquer these areas and make great profit for themselves. Overall, like I said earlier, this competition for trade led to conflicts and rivalries. By 1588, Spain fought England in the Spanish Armada, and there were several reasons for that, which we previously had talked about. But also by the 1600s, there were wars beginning to exist between France and Britain, and these wars continue into the 18th century as well. Europe's colonial expansion led to a global exchange of goods, flora, fauna, cultural practices, and diseases, resulting in the destruction of some indigenous civilizations, a shift towards European dominance, and the expansion of the slave trade. The exchange of goods that took place shifted the power in Europe. Prior to the age of exploration, the Mediterranean was the basis of European trade and really the center of the European world. However, after the discovery of the New World, the power shifted to the Atlantic states, and this led to the creation of a world economy, a concept we'll discuss in a few minutes. One of the most important results of the age of exploration was the Columbian Exchange. This was the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases between the Old World, namely Eurasia and Africa, and the New World, North and South America. Some of the plants that went from the Americas to Europe included tobacco, the tomato, corn, and probably the most important was the potato, which helped to alleviate famine in many areas where they grew it, as it was an easy crop to grow. Plants that came from Europe, from the Old World to the New, included coffee beans and sugarcane. And later on, parts of South America were known for growing coffee, and the Caribbean islands were known for sugarcane, two crops that didn't even exist in those areas prior to 1492. And finally, diseases were spread between the two areas as well. And unfortunately for the Native Americans, they got the raw end of this deal. Smallpox, influenza, chickenpox, and measles were introduced into the New World. And as a result, 90% of Native Americans are going to die by the year 1600. The only disease that really the Native Americans gave to the Europeans was the introduction of syphilis, which spread throughout the European continent. These massive demographic changes are going to result in several different economic opportunities for the Europeans. And we will see the Europe that is going to thrive and begin to enter really its golden age during this time period. They also are going to create, like I said, the demographic disaster that occurred to the indigenous people in the Americas. Those that did survive were often enslaved, whether in comenda system. But one interesting feature will be the creation of a new group of people, mestizos, mixed Europeans and Native Americans, which will be predominant even today in Latin America. We're also going to see, because of the destruction, the demographic disaster that occurred in the New World, the introduction of the slaves to Europe. As stated earlier, during the 16th century, plantation economies developed, especially in the islands. And as more and more Native Americans were dying, the result of this demographic catastrophe was the importation of slaves from Africa. The way the slave trade worked, were African slave traders who lived along the coast would go a little further inland and hunt and capture people they would then sell to the European slave traders. Going across the Atlantic in a perilous voyage known as the Middle Passage, where they were trapped in areas about the size of a coffin, often forced to lay in their own excrement. If they survived the journey, they made it to the Americas, where they were sold for profit. Keep in mind, the owners of the ships wanted to put as many Africans on the ship as possible in order to make more profit. And once in the New World, slave traders auctioned them off to the highest bidder. Although this map does not reflect it, the greatest majority of slaves were brought to Brazil. However, the second largest number of slaves were brought to the islands, where they worked on the sugar plantations. The African slave trade was a part of the triangular trade, which included raw materials being shipped from the Americas to Europe. In Europe, they were made into manufactured goods, where they were traded with the Africans as well as sent back to the New World for sale. This key concept, our next review will be key concept 1.5.